Story 1. The River of Unbecoming. The gray waters of the Ganges drifted with a silent, heavy purpose through the outskirts of Varanasi, carrying the weight of 1,000 prayers and the ashes of the forgotten into the infinite embrace of the sea. A young seeker sat upon the parched earth, his eyes fixed upon the swirling eddies that formed and dissolved with indifferent precision along the muddy banks. He was plagued by the haunting specter of tomorrow, a mental construct built from the brittle debris of yesterday, which loomed over his present awareness like a storm cloud that refused to break. His mind functioned as a complex loom, weaving endless tapestries of potential catastrophe and imagined lack-sound, ensuring that his consciousness remained tethered to a destination that did not yet exist. Across the clearing, the awakened one moved with a stillness that seemed to absorb the very heat of the afternoon sun, his every step a testament to a profound lack of resistance against the unfolding of the world. The seeker watched the silt rise and fall within the current, realizing with a sudden, sharp clarity that the water he had touched only a moment ago was already miles away. Yet the river remained as a conceptual whole. This paradox of identity created a deep friction within his internal landscape, for he sought to find a stable point within the flow of existence, a solid rock upon which he could stand to escape the relentless movement of time. Every thought of the future was merely a phantom limb reaching for a phantom fruit, a biological error of anticipation that ignored the physiological reality of the now. The internal structure of his worry revealed itself as a desperate attempt to solidify the vaporous nature of being, a struggle to architect a fortress out of smoke and memory. He observed how the mind projected its own deep-seated insecurities upon the blank canvas of the days to come, turning the infinite potential of the void into a narrow prison of expectation and dread. The Buddha gestured toward a single falling leaf, which spiraled toward the earth without a hint of resistance or a desire to return to the branch. In that silent descent, the seeker perceived the utter futility of his architectural anxieties and the cognitive dissonance of trying to plan for a self that was constantly being rewritten by the environment. The weight of his concern for the next season began to dissolve as he recognized the transparency of the ego that was supposedly doing the worrying. If there was no fixed center within the storm of sensations, then there was no one for the future to harm or to elevate. The tension in his shoulders ebbed away into the fine dust of the path, replaced by a neutral awareness of the sensory field. He saw that the mind often mistakes the map for the territory, and the future is but a map drawn in the sand while the tide is coming in. The silence between his breaths grew wider, swallowing the frantic whispers of what if and maybe that had previously dominated his inner dialogue. The vastness of the present moment was not a point in time, but a liberation from the very concept of temporal progression. He began to understand that the fear of the future was actually a fear of the present's inherent instability, a rejection of the fundamental truth that nothing can be held. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long and distorted shadows across the river, the seeker felt the boundaries of his personality blurring into the rhythm of the water. The internal chatter regarding his destiny fell silent, replaced by the empirical observation of the cool air touching his skin and the scent of damp earth rising from the banks. He was no longer a traveler looking toward a distant shore, but the very act of traveling itself, devoid of a goal and free from the burden of arrival. The architecture of his worry had collapsed, leaving behind a vast and open space where the future could arrive without being invited or feared. He sat in the gathering dark, a part of the landscape that no longer needed to name itself or its direction. The river continued its journey, and for the first time in his life, he was not trying to swim against it. Story 2. The Shadow of the Banyan. Deep within the shadowed groves of Jetavana, the ancient roots of a banyan tree clawed at the soil with the tenacity of 1,000 forgotten memories, creating a labyrinthine sanctuary of wood and silence. A merchant who had recently seen his vast fortune vanish like mist sat in the damp cool of these roots, his heart heavy with the crushing dread of the coming winter and the social ruin it promised. He perceived the future as a gaping maw of lack, a dark cavern ready to swallow the remnants of his dignity and his family's comfort. He watched the monks moving in rhythmic slow motion through the trees, their robes appearing like orange embers against the deep, prehistoric green of the forest. The Buddha sat nearby, not in a state of prayer or petition, but in a state of pure, unadulterated observation that transcended the human categories of gain and loss. The merchant began to analytically deconstruct the architecture of his own despair, noting how each thought of tomorrow triggered a cascade of physiological tension in his chest and throat. He noticed that the shadow he cast upon the ground was only visible because of the brilliant light of the present sun. Yet his consciousness was focused entirely on the darkness of the projection. His anxiety was a form of self-imposed mental taxation on a wealth he no longer possessed and a poverty he had not yet fully inhabited. The internal structure of his mind was a series of interlocking fears, each one feeding the next in a closed loop of temporal obsession that blinded him to the reality of the air entering his lungs. He saw that the future was merely a mirror reflecting his own perceived inadequacy in the current moment. As a sudden wind rustled the high leaves above, he realized that each sound was a birth and a death occurring simultaneously in the sensory field, leaving no trace of what came before. There was no continuity in the forest except that which his memory manufactured to create a sense of safety. The fear of the future was the fear of a ghost, an entity that possessed no substance but had the power to paralyze the living. The Buddha did not offer comfort in the form of reassurances or promises of recovery, but rather acted as a silent mirror to the merchant's own internal mechanism of suffering. The realization slowly dawned that the frantic struggle to secure the future was the very activity that made the present moment feel unbearable and thin. He observed the monks accepting their meager alms with a gesture of radical openness, their bowls held out not in a spirit of greed, but as an acknowledgement of their total dependence on the flux of the world. This vulnerability was not a weakness, but their greatest strength, for they had nothing to lose and therefore nothing to fear from the passage of time. The merchant's mind began to soften, the rigid boundaries of his identity as a wealthy man blurring into the complex texture of the forest floor. He was no longer a merchant in exile, but a shifting collection of sensations and perceptions moving like the dappled light through the canopy. The future ceased to be a destination to be reached or avoided and became an irrelevant abstraction that held no more weight than the dust motes dancing in the air. He understood that the mind's attempt to predict the future was a biological survival mechanism that had become a psychological burden. By dropping the need to know what would happen in the next moon, he suddenly found himself in possession of an immense and unshakable wealth of presence. The looming winter lost its teeth as he realized that the person who would face it was not the person sitting under the tree today. Each moment produced a new self, and that new self would have its own resources to meet its own challenges. The grip of his worry loosened, and he felt a profound sense of relief as if he had dropped a heavy stone he had been carrying for miles. The banyan tree stood as it always had, indifferent to his past success or his future failure, providing shade to whoever was there to receive it. He closed his eyes and listened to the pulse of the forest, a rhythm that did not look forward or backward, but simply existed in the eternal resonance of the now. Story 3. The Potter of Vaishali. The kiln in the outskirts of Vaishali breathed with a rhythmic, orange intensity that seemed to mimic the very heartbeat of the sweltering afternoon, casting long, flickering shadows against the sun-baked walls of the workshop. A potter sat before his wheel, his hands caked in the fine, gray silt of the riverbank, yet his mind was miles away, navigating the treacherous terrain of a harvest festival that was still 3 months in the distance. He was engaged in a complex mental simulation, calculating the potential yield of his labor and the social standing that would follow a successful showing, or the catastrophic shame that would accompany a failure in the firing process. This internal theater was so vivid that the physical reality of the damp clay beneath his fingers became a secondary, almost ghostly sensation. His consciousness functioned as a relentless architect of anxiety, constructing elaborate scaffolds of expectation upon the shifting sands of probability. He saw each pot not as a vessel for water, but as a vessel for his own projected identity, a fragile container for a self that demanded validation from a future that had not yet been born. The Buddha walked past the workshop with a step so light it barely disturbed the fine dust of the road, his presence a silent critique of the potter's frantic internal activity. The potter noticed the Blessed One, and for a brief moment, the wheel slowed, allowing the rhythm of the present to penetrate the thick fog of his preoccupations. He realized that the clay was currently in a state of absolute potential, possessing no inherent shape other than that which his hands and the laws of physics imposed upon it in this specific second. The fragility of the unbaked vessel was a perfect metaphor for the nature of the mind, which constantly attempts to bake its desires into a permanent form before they have even encountered the fire of experience. He observed the movement of his own thoughts as they jumped from the moisture of the clay to the heat of the kiln and then to the gold coins of the merchant, skipping over the actual act of creation entirely. This temporal leaping was a form of psychological violence, a refusal to inhabit the only space where life was actually occurring. The internal structure of his worry revealed a deep-seated rejection of the transitional nature of matter. He wanted the pot to be finished. He wanted the festival to be over. He wanted the security of a concluded event. Yet the beauty of the craft lay in the unfolding. As the wheel spun, he began to consciously dissolve the boundaries between his intention and the physical resistance of the earth. The future festival began to lose its sharp edges, receding into the background until it was nothing more than a faint, irrelevant hum in the distance. He saw that the mind's obsession with the next moment was a strategy to avoid the vulnerability of being truly present with the current one. To be present was to acknowledge that he had no control over the outcome, that a crack in the kiln or a sudden rain could render his labor moot. Instead of fighting this uncertainty, he began to lean into it, finding a strange and profound peace in the lack of a guarantee. The clay responded to this shift in his internal state, rising into a more elegant and balanced form as the tension left his wrists. The potter was no longer working for the festival, but was instead participating in a timeless dialogue between consciousness and the physical world. The sun began to set, cooling the air and softening the harsh light of the workshop, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the wet silt and the spinning wheel. The future remained unknown and unwritten, but the fear of it had been replaced by an empirical curiosity. He understood that if he could stay with the clay in this moment, he would have the strength to stay with whatever the future brought, whether it was a broken pot or a celebrated masterpiece. The heavy burden of anticipation fell away, leaving him light and empty as the very vessels he was creating. Story 4. The Architect of Shravasti. The blueprints for the new wing of the royal palace in Shravasti were spread across a long table of polished cedar, aing, their intricate lines representing a dream of structural perfection that the king hoped would endure for 1,000 years. The lead architect stood over them in the dim light of dawn, his mind a chaotic assembly of stress and meticulous calculation regarding the integrity of the foundations and the quality of the limestone coming from the northern quarries. He was paralyzed by the thought of a future earthquake or the slow, inevitable erosion of the monsoon rains, seeing every stone not for its current strength but for its eventual decay. His internal landscape was a fortress under siege by the ghost of time, and his every thought was an attempt to defend against a future that was fundamentally indifferent to his designs. The Buddha sat in the shade of a nearby stone wall, watching the architect with a quiet, penetrating gaze that seemed to see right through the physical scrolls into the roiling anxiety of the man's soul. The architect looked at the awakened one and felt a sudden, sharp dissonance between his own desire for perpetuity and the obvious transience of the world around him. He realized that he was attempting to build a monument to his own ego, using stone and mortar to suppress his own fear of the void. The mind, in its desperate search for safety, had projected a need for permanence onto a reality that was defined by constant flux. He began to examine the structure of his own worry, noting how it relied on the assumption that a future disaster was more real than the present peace of the morning. This cognitive bias toward negativity was a survival mechanism that had become a prison, preventing him from appreciating the subtle beauty of the geometry he had created. He saw that the stones would indeed crumble one day, just as the king would pass and the kingdom would fade into the dust of history. And this realization initially felt like a heavy blow to his chest. However, as he continued to observe the stillness of the Buddha, the weight began to shift into a liberating lightness. If nothing was meant to last, then the pressure to create something eternal was a self-imposed delusion. The internal movement of his consciousness transitioned from a state of defensive contraction to one of expansive acceptance. He looked at the blueprints again and saw them not as a battle plan against time, but as a temporary arrangement of form that served a current purpose. The future earthquake ceased to be a personal enemy and became a natural possibility, one that did not require his current suffering as a down payment. He felt the tension in his neck and shoulders dissolve as he dropped the impossible task of outrunning the ages. The process of building became a meditation in itself, an act of honoring the materials in the present without demanding that they serve his vanity in the future. He understood that the only true foundation was not made of stone, but of a mind that was no longer divided against itself by the fear of tomorrow. The architect felt a surge of creative energy that was no longer drained by the leak of anxiety. He began to work with a new precision, his hands moving with the grace of a man who has nothing to prove and nothing to lose. The complex mathematical problems that had previously felt like obstacles now seemed like interesting puzzles to be solved for the sheer joy of the effort. He saw that the future was not a destination he was building toward, but a series of present moments that would arrive when they were ready. By relinquishing his grip on the legacy of the building, he found himself fully immersed in the life of the building. The Buddha rose and walked away, leaving the architect in the rising sun, a man who was no longer building a tomb for his fears, but a shelter for the living. The air was cool and the light was gold, and for the first time in his career, the architect was not afraid of the wind. Story 5. The Weaver of Kashi. The rhythmic clatter of the wooden loom in a small hut on the outskirts of Kashi sounded like the persistent heartbeat of an anxious mind, weaving not just silk, but the very fabric of a tomorrow that refused to be still. An elderly weaver sat with his spine curved like a weathered bow, his fingers moving with a mechanical grace born of 40 years of labor. Yet his inner gaze was fixed upon a winter that had not yet arrived. He visualized the empty market stalls and the cold wind biting through his threadbare cloak, creating a mental architecture of scarcity that made the warm afternoon sun feel like a cruel irony. His consciousness was a complex intersection of memory and projection, where the ghost of past poverty dictated the colors of his future fears. He saw each strand of crimson thread as a fragile lifeline, and the possibility of a single knot or a fraying edge felt like a moral catastrophe. The Buddha walked slowly through the weaver's district, his golden robe a silent contrast to the dusty gray of the industrial struggle. The weaver looked up, and for a fleeting second, the shuttle stopped mid-motion, suspended in a void between the completed pattern and the unformed void. In that stillness, he noticed that the pattern he so desperately tried to control was actually an emergent property of thousands of individual momentary choices. He realized that his worry about the finished garment was a form of psychological blindness that obscured the vibrant reality of the thread currently passing through his thumb. The mind's tendency to leap over the act of weaving to dwell in the uncertainty of the sail was a biological error, a refusal to accept the inherent stability of the present moment. He began to observe the movement of his own anxiety as if it were just another color in the loom, a dark thread that did not need to dominate the entire design. The internal structure of his dread began to soften as he recognized that the future winter was a conceptual ghost, while the wood of the loom was solid and the silk was cool to the touch. To worry about the future was to attempt to wear a coat that had not been woven, leaving the current self shivering in a draft of its own making. He saw that the self who would experience the winter was not the self sitting here today, but a future iteration that would have its own strength and its own context. The obsession with continuity was the source of his friction, and by letting go of the need for the pattern to remain identical to his imagination, he found a radical freedom. The shuttle began to move again, but the rhythm was different now, slower and more deliberate, attuned to the immediate resistance of the thread rather than the distant demands of the market. He understood that impermanence was not a threat to his livelihood, but the very condition that allowed for the possibility of a new beginning with every pass of the wood. The fear of the future dissolved into a profound appreciation for the complexity of the current task. As the evening shadows lengthened across the dirt floor, he felt a deep sense of equilibrium, knowing that the only way to build a future was to inhabit the present so fully that the boundary between the two simply ceased to exist. Story 6. The Wayfarer of the Mountain Pass. The high mountain pass leading into the kingdom of Magadha was a place where the wind spoke in the tongues of ancient stones, and the air grew thin and cold as the breath of a dying star. A traveler stood at the precipice, his eyes searching the horizon for the city he hoped to reach before the moon completed its cycle. He was burdened not by his pack, but by the heavy anticipation of what lay on the other side of the ridge, a mental weight that made every uphill step feel like a penance. His mind was a restless cartographer, drawing and redrawing the path ahead, calculating the risks of storms and the possibility of bandits, effectively living his life in a future that was composed entirely of shadows. The physiological toll of this constant projection was evident in his shallow breathing and the rigid set of his jaw. The Buddha sat upon a flat rock near the summit, his posture a perfect expression of verticality and ease, appearing as if he were an organic extension of the mountain itself. The traveler paused and sat nearby, his gaze still fixed on the distant valley, yet the silent presence of the awakened one began to act as a catalyst for a deeper internal inquiry. He noticed that the horizon he chased was an optical illusion that retreated at the exact speed of his own progress, much like the future he so desperately tried to secure. This realization sent a tremor through the foundations of his consciousness. revealing the fundamental futility of his temporal pursuit. He began to examine the mechanics of his own movement, seeing how each step was a momentary loss of balance, followed by a momentary recovery. This cycle of falling and catching oneself was the very essence of walking. Yet his mind demanded a state of permanent arrival. The internal structure of his worry was revealed as a desire for a destination that would finally allow him to stop being aware of the present. He saw that the fear of the future was actually a fear of the process of living, a rejection of the instability that is the hallmark of all biological existence. The Buddha's eyes were not focused on any distant point, but seemed to encompass the entire sensory field in a single, unified embrace. The traveler felt his own perspective shift from the narrow corridor of the path to the vastness of the mountain range. The future kingdom of Magadha became a distant concept, no more real than the dreams he had forgotten upon waking. He understood that by obsessing over the end of the journey, he was effectively negating the only part of the journey that possessed any reality. The weight of his pack seemed to lighten as he dropped the mental baggage of his expectations. He saw that the mountain did not care if he reached the valley or if he remained at the summit. It simply offered a surface upon which he could experience the movement of his own breath. This empirical detachment allowed him to see the beauty of the gray lichen on the stones and the way the light fractured through the thin ice of a mountain stream. The future ceased to be a source of anxiety and became a neutral void into which he could step with curiosity rather than dread. He stood up, not with the intention of finishing the journey, but with the intention of taking the next step. The distinction was subtle but transformative. He was no longer a man running away from his present to find a future peace, but a man who carried peace within him like a hidden spring. The descent into the valley began, and for the first time, the traveler did not look down the path, but instead watched the fine dust rise from beneath his sandals, each grain a testament to the eternal, vanishing now.